The Young and the Restless spoilers shock. Society had a way of pretending it was neutral ground, a polished room where the right lighting and the right music could make anything feel civilized, even business. But when Holden walked in and found Audra already there, seated like she belonged to every shadow and every spotlight at once, the illusion cracked. The air tightened, not because of what was being said, but because of what had already been lived between the old decisions, old bargains, old humiliations that never fully died. Only changed costumes. Holden's posture carried the kind of rigid control that passes for calm until you look close enough to see it shaking at the seams, while Audra's stillness was the opposite, not peace, but calculation. Their eyes met and the room's noise faded into something distant and unimportant, like society itself had leaned back to watch. It wasn't a reunion. It was a collision of two people who knew the ugliest version of each other and had never forgiven it. They started carefully, as if each word was a glass they could set down without breaking. But the past was a crude, heavy object between them, and it kept scraping against everything. Audra didn't need to raise her voice to make the conversation feel like a threat. She only needed to imply she remembered the parts Holden wished he could bury. Holden tried to keep it in the present-small talk, dismissive remarks, the typical armor people wear when they're terrified of what they might say if they let themselves speak honestly. Audra let him have that for a moment, then punctured it with a single, precise reference to their shared rot, the kind of history that wasn't romantic or tragic, just dirty. The moment she named it, Holden's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking away for half a second like his body tried to physically dodge the memory. That was all the confirmation Audra needed. She smiled, not warmly, not politely, but with the sharp satisfaction of someone who had found the bruise and realized it was still tender. The argument didn't begin with a scream. It began with Audra's patience. She baited him the way she always had, slow, deliberate, as if she were laying down a trail he would be compelled to follow even while he hated himself for it. She teased apart his mistakes and held them up like evidence, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she wanted him to feel cornered. Holden tried to shut it down, telling her she didn't get to define him anymore, that she wasn't going to rewrite his story with her venom, that whatever they once were had no authority over his life now. The more he insisted on that distance, the more Audra leaned in with those casual, devastating questions that were never really questions. She hinted at old failures that still echoed in his choices, old betrayals he had convinced himself were necessary. And she did it with a tone that implied she could see through him better than anyone else in Genoa City. Holden could feel the rage rise like heat under his skin, not only at her cruelty but at the humiliating truth that it worked. He had spent so long trying to outrun the parts of himself that Audra knew by name, and here she was, effortlessly dragging him back into that version of his life. The patrons around them continued laughing and sipping and living, but a private storm had formed at their table, and it grew with every sentence. Audra pushed harder, accusing him of always playing the victim when he was the one who had chosen the worst possible path again and again. She made it personal, then made it public in a way that felt public even without an audience, as Holden's pride was always watching. She mocked the idea that he had changed, suggested he was still the same man who panicked when consequences arrived, still someone who would ruin people if it meant saving his own skin. Holden's hand tightened around his glass until he could feel the pressure in his knuckles. He told himself not to give her this satisfaction, but Audra wasn't looking for a tantrum, she was looking for a crack. And the truth was, Holden was exhausted. Exhausted from pretending he had everything under control, exhausted from fear disguised as confidence, exhausted from carrying secrets that kept him awake at night and made him jump whenever his phone buzzed. When Audra finally said Claire's name, not as an innocent mention, but as a weapon, Holden's restraint snapped at it loudly, not theatrically, but suddenly, like a rope breaking after being pulled too tight for too long. It spilled out of him before he could stop it. A raw confession sharpened into a threat because anger has a way of turning vulnerability into violence. Holden's words hit the table like a slammed fist. Claire was pregnant, and the baby was his. For a fraction of a second after he said it, he looked almost relieved, as if the secret had been physically heavy and now it was no longer trapped inside his chest. Then reality returned and the relief curdled into horror. The silence that followed was brutal. It wasn't the kind of silence society offered when a conversation paused. It was the kind of silence that feels like a trap closing. Audra's expression froze first, her eyes widening just enough to expose shock, the genuine kind that can't be faked, and Holden watched it register in stages. First disbelief, as if her mind tried to reject the information because it was too perfectly catastrophic. Then curiosity, because Audra's instincts were built to find opportunity inside disaster. Then finally, understanding sharp, bright, almost reverent as she realized what he had given her. Holden could practically see her calculating who Claire was, who Claire mattered to, how a pregnancy could be framed, leaked, twisted, weaponized. Audra didn't need details yet. She could smell the leverage. Holden's anger evaporated, replaced by the sick sensation of having just handed a loaded gun to someone who had been waiting for a reason to use it. He tried to reclaim the moment, to warn her off, to tell her it wasn't her business, that she should keep her mouth shut if she knew what was good for her. But those words sounded pathetic the second they left him. Audra's shock softened into something else, a slow curve at the corner of her mouth that made her look almost pleased to be alive. It wasn't happiness, it was hunger. She leaned back slightly, as if settling into her seat more comfortably now that the balance of power had shifted. And her eyes gleamed with the kind of satisfaction that comes when vengeance suddenly becomes possible. Holden realized with a cold clarity that he hadn't just confessed. He had offered Audra a gift, and Audra was the kind of person who always unwrapped gifts with a knife. Audra's mind raced ahead of her face, and even as she kept her voice measured, her thoughts were already constructing a blueprint. Claire carrying Holden's child wasn't simply scandal. It was a bomb with multiple blast radii. Claire's reputation, her stability, her future, everything could be questioned. Her relationships could be turned into battlegrounds, and the most obvious casualty would be Kyle. Because Kyle's world was built on loyalty and legacy and the dangerous belief that he could control chaos if he tried hard enough. Audra understood Kyle well enough to predict the shape of his reaction, not just heartbreak or anger, but a kind of feral obsession with fixing what couldn't be fixed. Kyle wouldn't merely be upset, he would unravel. And in his unraveling, he would make decisions that could be guided, provoked, exploited. Audra didn't have to strike Claire directly if she could turn Kyle into the instrument of Claire's downfall. She imagined the sequence as clean and inevitable, a whisper placed in the right ear, a hint dropped where it would travel. A suggestion that Claire had lied, manipulated, used Kyle as a shield. Even the timing could be perfected just at the moment Claire needed peace most, when she was trying to steady herself. When she thought she had managed to keep the truth contained until it was safe. Audra's resentment toward Claire wasn't petty. It was personal, fueled by old humiliations and the kind of jealousy that becomes righteous when it's dressed up as justice. In Audra's mind, Claire had always been allowed to recover, to be forgiven, to be protected by powerful names and patient hearts. Audra had never forgotten how unfair that felt, and now she could see a way to strip that protection away without ever getting her own hands dirty. She could destroy Claire by making the people around Claire do it for her. Holden watched Audra's face and knew she was already rehearsing the version of events she would sell, Claire as a liar, Holden as the inconvenient truth, Kyle as the betrayed man pushed into desperation. And the most terrifying part was how plausible it could all be if Audra controlled the narrative. In Genoa City, perception often mattered more than facts. Audra had built her life on that. She didn't need the whole story. She only needed the part that would bruise the right people in the right place. Neither of them noticed the server at first, because society trained its staff to become invisible. The server moved like a shadow between tables, carrying polished glassware and practiced smiles. But tonight that invisibility turned into something else, access. When Holden blurted out the truth, the server had been close enough to hear every word, close enough to feel the shock ripple through the air, and close enough to understand instantly that this wasn't idle gossip. It was dynamite. The server's eyes flickered, not with curiosity, but with alarm, because this person wasn't just an employee overhearing drama. They were tethered, quietly and inconveniently, to the Abbott orbit through friendship. It was the kind of connection that never looked important until the moment it became crucial. A casual friendship with someone in the family's inner circle. A familiarity built over years of holidays, quick favors, unspoken loyalty. The server didn't want to be involved, but involvement had a way of finding people in Genoa City. They kept their expression neutral and their hands steady, delivering a plate to a nearby table as if nothing had happened, but their mind was already spinning with the weight of what they'd heard. If this secret reached the Abbotts, it wouldn't land gently. It would hit like a car crash. It would force decisions, split alliances, expose fault lines that were already under stress. The server knew that telling the truth could be framed as loyalty, but staying silent could be framed as betrayal if the truth surfaced later and it became clear someone had known. That was how the city worked. Silence was never neutral, not when powerful families were involved. The server moved away, heart pounding, eyes fixed forward, but the knowledge followed like a ghost. Behind them, Holden's face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with lighting, because he had realized too late that secrets weren't safe simply because you spoke them softly. Audra, on the other hand, looked almost serenely composed, like someone who had just been handed a map out of a maze. She didn't need to act immediately. She could savor the anticipation. She could wait for the perfect moment to strike, because revenge was always sweeter when it was time to cause maximum collapse. And somewhere in the near future, whether the truth leaked through Audra's deliberate cruelty or through the server's trembling sense of duty, Kyle would find out. The thought of it sat in the room like a second presence, inevitable and looming. Kyle's love had always been intense, sometimes noble, sometimes suffocating, and secrets like this didn't simply end relationships, she detonated identity. If Kyle believed Claire had chosen to hide a child with Holden, if he believed he had been used or made a fool of, he wouldn't respond with a clean break. He would respond with obsession. He would demand answers that Claire couldn't give without bleeding. He would chase control until control became violence in its own quiet way. And he would pull everyone around him into the orbit of his pain. Holden knew Kyle wasn't a man who accepted humiliation. Audra knew Kyle wasn't a man who handled betrayal with grace. Claire, caught between the truth and the consequences, would be forced to decide who she was willing to lose in order to protect herself and her unborn baby. And that decision would not come with a clean moral victory. In a city where every secret had a price, the bill was about to come due. Holden had wanted to win an argument, to feel powerful for one moment against Audra's merciless memory, and instead he had lit the fuse on something far bigger than either of them. Audra's smile lingered as she rose from the table, already imagining the wreckage, already tasting the moment Claire's life cracked open under public judgment. The server slipped into the back hallway, hands shaking as they reached for their phone, knowing one call could change everything. And Kyle was still walking around believing his world made sense, unaware that one sentence spoken in anger at society had just rewritten the map of his life. And when he finally learned the truth, going crazy wouldn't even begin to describe what would happen next. The threat didn't arrive as a dramatic spectacle. It arrived as a promise, delivered with the kind of calm that made it more terrifying than shouting. Holden didn't have to lean across the table or raise his voice for Audra to understand what he meant. The message was simple, brutal, and absolute. If she opened her mouth, she would not live long enough to regret it. The violence of it wasn't in any gesture, but in the certainty behind his eyes, the suggestion that he had already rehearsed how it would happen and where. As if he were stating logistics rather than committing a moral boundary. For a moment, the air between them tasted like metal. Society's warm lighting suddenly felt obscene, a luxury setting hosting something feral. Holden's mistake, however, was assuming fear would do what shame couldn't. Audra had learned long ago that fear was only useful when it belonged to someone else. She didn't recoil. She didn't soften. She stared back as if the word death were just another bargaining chip. Audra's whole life had been an exercise in surviving the worst version of people. She had been cornered before, threatened before. And she had learned that the most dangerous creature in Genoa City wasn't the man who promised violence, but the woman who decided she could live with it if the payoff was sweet enough. If Holden thought he was the only one capable of crossing lines, he was wrong. Audra didn't need to be physically powerful. She only needed to be willing. And she was. What Holden failed to see was that Audra's courage wasn't moral. It was strategic. She wasn't fearless because she believed in truth or justice. She was fearless because she understood leverage. If Kyle could be made to hate Claire, truly hate her in that visceral, obsessive way that turns love into a weapon, then the rest would follow. Kyle's anger would do the work. His heartbreak would magnify the story. His pride would make him lash out publicly. Audra wouldn't have to stand on a rooftop and shout the secret. She could drip it into the right places and watch Kyle become the storm. Even if Holden hunted her for it, Audra believed the risk was worth it because hatred, once planted, grows faster than fear. She imagined Kyle's eyes when he realized the betrayal, the way his hands would tremble with rage, the way his voice would sharpen into something everyone recognized as dangerous. She imagined him looking at Claire and seeing not the woman he thought he knew, but the lie he'd been living inside. That transformation, the pivot from devotion to contempt, was the opening Audra had been waiting for. All she needed was one crack in Kyle's loyalty, one fracture, a single moment where he stopped protecting Claire and started punishing her. Audra could step into that chaos with perfect timing, offering sympathy, understanding, a shoulder that looked safe because it wasn't Claire's. In her mind, it didn't matter if Kyle loved her. It only mattered that he used her, that he chose her presence over Claire's, that he let Audra become part of his daily life while Claire was pushed further into isolation. Revenge didn't need romance. Revenge only needed access. But the secret didn't exist in a vacuum, and Audra knew that too. In Genoa City, every scandal is a chain reaction, every confession a grenade tossed into multiple rooms. The moment this story reached Kyle, it would not stay confined to his world. It would detonate across to Empire Sabbath, and Newman Becca's Claire was never just Claire. She was a symbol, a complication, a pressure point. Jack's response wouldn't be measured. Jack had the kind of moral pride that turns into fury when he feels his family's integrity has been stained, especially by someone he considers beneath them. Jack would see Holden not as a flawed man, but as contamination, an intruder who had slipped into their orbit and threatened everything Jack believed he could protect: his son, his legacy, the stability he kept trying to build out of chaos. Jack's anger would be relentless. And the most dangerous part would be his certainty that he was justified. He would want Holden erased from their story completely, not merely rejected but destroyed socially, financially, emotionally. If the Abbotts had any influence left to use, they would use it to make Holden regret breathing in Genoa City. And Kyle, caught between grief and rage, would fuel that fire because there is nothing more combustible than a son trying to prove he is not weak. Victor's fury would be different, colder, and more surgical, because Victor wouldn't care about scandal the way Jack did. Victor would care about control. A pregnancy tied to Holden would represent unpredictability, and unpredictability is the one thing Victor treats like a personal insult. Victor would despise Holden not only for the damage he caused, but for the audacity of believing he could touch the lives of people Victor considers part of his domain. Victor would want Holden removed. And Victor's version of removal was never simple. It was consequences stacked so high a person couldn't stand up anymore. Pressure placed where it hurt. Doors closed. Deals killed. Accidents that didn't look like accidents. Victor would also see Audra as a variable, a woman with sharp edges who could be used or eliminated depending on which served him best. Victor doesn't trust opportunists. He employs them until they become a threat. If Audra looked like she was orchestrating this mess, Victor would watch her closely because Victor hates being manipulated more than he hates betrayal. Holden's threat of death might not be the only one Audra would face if this blew up. In the Newman world, a person can survive scandal. Surviving Victor's attention is another story. The city's hatred for Holden would become a kind of consensus, one of those rare moments when enemies agree simply because they share disgust. Jack would want him gone. Ka would want him punished. Victor would want him neutralized. Even people who barely knew Holden would turn their faces away because the story would paint him as the man who brought poison into two powerful bloodlines at once. Holden would become untouchable in the way that matters in Genoa City. No one would offer him safety. No one would risk their reputation by standing too close. He would be isolated, cornered, and isolation makes dangerous men more dangerous. The more Holden felt the walls closing, the more likely he would act out because men like Holden don't surrender. They lash out and call it survival. That is what would make Audra's situation so precarious. If Holden believed his life was collapsing because she spoke, he wouldn't simply blame her, would hunt her. And yet, Audra still wouldn't be afraid in the way Holden wanted her to be. Fear would flicker at the edges, yes, but it would be swallowed by the thrill of watching the Abbotts and Newmans burn someone else instead of her. If Holden became the common enemy, Audra could move through the chaos like a ghost. No one would be watching her hands while they were all staring at Holden's. And then there was Claire, the true center of the storm, the one who would have to stand in the blast radius and decide what kind of woman she would be when everyone demanded she crumble. Claire would face this in layers, because the danger wasn't only external. It would be internal, a battle between her instinct to protect herself and her instinct to protect the people she had already hurt by keeping the secret. She would feel the weight of pregnancy not as a miracle, not as a sweet future, but as a ticking clock attached to her body. Every day she stayed silent would feel like another crime in Kyle's eyes once he learned the truth. Every attempt to explain would sound like an excuse to him if Audra framed the narrative first. Claire's challenge wouldn't be simply surviving people's anger. It would be surviving the version of herself that might start believing she deserved it. Because guilt is its own prison, and Claire was already vulnerable to that kind of self-destruction. She would ask herself whether she could have handled it differently, whether confessing earlier would have saved Kyle's trust, whether telling Jack first would have controlled the damage. But Genoa City doesn't reward honesty, it weaponizes it. Claire would realize that no matter when she told the truth, someone like Audra would have found a way to twist it. That realization could either break her or harden her. If Claire chose softness, she would become prey. She would apologize too much, explain too much, beg Kyle to understand, and in doing so she would give him the power to define her. Kyle's anger would feed on her desperation. Jack would see her as reckless. Victor would see her as unstable. Audra would see her as weak. Holden would see her as exposed. If Claire chose hardness, though, if she decided she would not be humiliated in public, not be reduced to tears for other people's entertainment, she could shift the dynamics. Claire could refuse to chase Kyle, refuse to plead. She could anchor herself in the one undeniable fact: this baby exists, and it deserves protection more than any man's pride deserves comfort. Claire could meet Kyle's fury with the kind of stillness that terrifies emotionally volatile people, the kind that says, "I won't break for you." That doesn't mean she would be cold. It means she would be controlled, deliberate. She would set boundaries not as punishments, but as survival. She would decide what she would disclose and to whom, and she would not let Audra be the one writing the story. Claire would have to become her own advocate in a city where women are often forced to perform innocence in order to be spared. She could choose a different performance, truth without begging, responsibility without self-erasure. The most logical move for Claire, once the secret started leaking, would be to understand that she was not only dealing with emotions but with power structures. She would need to anticipate how Jack and Victor would act, because those men don't simply react, they strategize. Claire would realize she couldn't win by isolating herself. She would need allies not for romance, but for credibility. She would have to decide whether to confront Holden directly, whether to expose his threats, whether to put his danger on record in a way that could protect her if he escalated. The cruel irony is that the best protection against a man threatening murder is often to make that threat known before he can act. Claire would have to swallow her shame and speak to people who could keep her safe, even if those people also judged her. She might have to accept that Jack's fury is still more manageable than Holden's violence, and Victor's anger is still safer than Holden's desperation. Claire could use the fact that everyone hates Holden to her advantage. If she framed Holden as the true threat, dangerous and stable, willing to kill, then the Abbotts and Newmans would have a common goal: remove Holden from her orbit. In that scenario, Claire's pregnancy becomes less of a scandal and more of a hostage situation, and that shift in framing could change how people respond. It doesn't erase what she did, but it reorders priorities. In Genoa City, people will forgive many sins if they can justify it as protecting family. Kyle, however, would be the hardest part. Kyle's rage would not be purely about betrayal, it would be about humiliation. He would feel like the last to know, the man made foolish in his own family's eyes, the son whose judgment could be questioned. That is why he would spiral. He wouldn't only be angry at Claire, he would be angry at himself for choosing her, trusting her, building a future with her. Audra would feed that shame by suggesting Claire had played him, and Holden's existence would feel like proof. Kyle might try to reclaim power by doing something drastic, cutting Claire off, demanding paternity tests, threatening legal action, turning family resources into weapons. He could become obsessed with controlling the narrative so he doesn't look weak. But the more he tries to control it, the more he becomes predictable, and predictable people are easy to manipulate. Claire would have to decide whether she still loves Kyle enough to weather that storm or whether she must step away to save herself and the baby. She might even realize that Kyle's love, when threatened, can turn into possession, and possession is not safety. That's a terrifying clarity for a woman who is pregnant and suddenly sees that the men around her are not just emotional, they are volatile. The most painful truth Claire could face is that she cannot force Kyle to be gentle. She can only decide what she will tolerate. Audra's endgame would be to position herself as the safe option, the woman who didn't betray Kyle, the woman who was there when Claire's world collapsed. But Audra's flaw, arrogance echoed, also become her weakness. Because if Claire chooses strength, she could expose Audra's pattern, that Audra thrives on other women's ruin. Claire could make it clear, in quiet but devastating ways, that Audra isn't Kyle's salvation, is Kyle's addiction to vengeance. If Claire can get Kyle to see that, even briefly, Audra loses her perfect opening. Yet Audra is experienced enough to anticipate resistance. She would strike when Claire is most alone, when Kyle is most unstable, when Jack is most furious. She would offer Kyle permission to hate, and hatred is intoxicating. Kyle might not even realize he is letting Audra in. He would just feel understood. That is how Audra would win without ever needing Kyle to truly love her. So how would Claire face it? She would face it by refusing to collapse into the role everyone expects of her. She would face it by separating remorse from self-destruction, by telling the truth on her own terms before Audra sells a version that makes her look monstrous, by exposing Holden's threats and forcing the powerful men in this city to focus on the immediate danger rather than just the scandal, by protecting her pregnancy as a priority, not a bargaining chip, and hardest of all, by accepting that Kyle's reaction is screaming anger, his spiraling grief, his need to punish is as much about Kyle as it does about her. Claire could choose to fight for him, but she could also choose to protect herself from him if his love turns into something cruel. That decision, that refusal to be destroyed for the sake of a man's pride, is what could turn this from Claire's downfall into Claire's transformation. The storm is coming either way. The question isn't whether Claire will be judged. The question is whether she will let their judgment write her ending, or whether she will take the narrative back before Audra and Holden turn her life into their war.